This is an amazing event with an amazing audience and important speakers who have generously accepted our invitation. Let me thank the Margarete von Brentano Centrum for hosting us. It's a great center that promotes, fosters gender studies. Well, every day, every hour, excruciating news comes from Ukraine. Gender-based violence is de rigueur. It's high time to analyze and interpret the war, Russia's war on Ukraine, from the perspective of gender and queer studies. I think that our outstanding speakers will not only interpret the world, but also change it, as Marx would put it. Thank you for finding the time. And just briefly, why war? This is correspondence between Freud and Einstein, which is still topical today, but lacking a gender and queer aspect. That is why I've invited, thanks to the Margarete von Brentano Center, outstanding eminent specialists in feminist and LGBTQ studies. The war constitutes the epitome of violent patriarchy, machismo, and homophobia. This is a clash of anti-woman, anti-queer, anti-foreigner totalitarianism versus an emerging democracy. Has Putin desired more will to power over the other? Has he wanted to eliminate the Kristevan strangers? Well, that's it from me, and I would like to invite the first speaker, who is Professor Tamara Marceniuk from Ukraine's National University of Kiev Mohyla Academy. That's the most established and the oldest university in Ukraine. And Tamara Marceniuk studied not only there, but also at the University of Oslo. She was also a postdoc at Stanford. She has published at least 2 books. One of them is entitled, of course it's in Ukrainian, but let me translate it, Gender for All. Tamara, Professor Tamara, the floor is yours.
Dear Tomasz and dear guests, thanks a lot for inviting me for this wonderful event. And I would like to present my sociological perspective of the situation with war in Ukraine. I will share my screen.
Tamara, you are unmuted. You're muted. No? Can you try?
Sorry. Now
Yes.
can you hear me? I'm sorry. I will present women's involvement in Russia's war against Ukraine. And as a sociologist, especially public sociologist, I do believe that it's possible to understand why Ukrainian society resists this huge invasion through the understanding of women's role and women's involvement in these events. And first of all, I would like to demonstrate some legacy that we could see from Euromaidan protests and war in Donbass that started 8 years ago. I have a number of publications on women's participation in Euromaidan protests, and I would say that Ukrainian women managed to challenge traditional gender roles as caretakers and victims of conflict, and reclaimed visibility, recognition, and respect as volunteers and revolutionaries. So it became possible on different events in Euromaidan to criticize sexism and other forms of inequality, and actually huge, I would say, rather big changes happened after these events. And also, when war in Donbass started after annexation of Crimea, women joined the front lines as volunteers, journalists, medical staff, and military on combat positions. And being a public scholar, I was approached by a group of military women, among them Maria Berlinska, who asked me for help to study gender discrimination in military labor market. And with a group of other sociologists, we conducted 3 large sociological studies called Invisible Battalion. Those studies, they were done as liberal feminist studies, and they demonstrated successes and challenges of gender equality implementation in the Ukrainian armed forces. Also, the visibility of female veterans, as far as currently in Ukraine, as a result of Donbass war, there are around 500,000 of veterans, and women are very visible group among them. And also we manage even to pay attention to such very problematic topics in the armed forces as sexual harassment. And currently there are a number of court cases on this, also on bullying, suicides, etc. So actually, we could see that for last 7-8 years, Ukrainian armed forces changed quite a lot, and women became a very visible group in them. Currently, with women's participation in war, sociologically, I could see women as, from one hand, agents or actors of resistance, from other hand, as victims. And of course, very often when we analyze wars from feminist perspective, of course, depends which type of feminism, we pay attention to women as victim. At the same time, so later I will mention also these aspects, but I do believe that it's very important to talk about women as agents and actors of resistance. And first of all, women are very actively participating in armed resistance as military, and you could see now in social media a number of different pictures and different posters where actually women are portrayed as through their agency, not as victims but agents. You could see different like diversity of women of different age groups. They participate and they are quite famous as volunteers. For example, in this picture where a volunteer trying to help dogs with disability to evacuate them from Irpin. This picture became quite famous. And of course, women participate not only in armed resistance, but in different forms of help and volunteering. And as we could see results of public opinion survey conducted after 10 days when mass invasion happened, 67% of Ukrainians, they are ready to personally participate in the armed resistance to end the occupation. and majority of them, so men are more, but at the same time, more than half of all women, they are ready to participate with arms. And as I said before, as a result of different reforms in armed forces and quite long process of gender equality implementation in the armed forces of Ukraine, women, they became quite visible group, and they now around 25% of armed forces are women. And for the last years, women, they even managed to break glass ceiling, I would say. Some of them, now we have 2 female generals, and it became, as I said, possible to talk on the very problematic issues like sexual harassment and others. And famous women and volunteer, despite the idea that when we that women are those who are asking for peace, we could see that different groups of women and famous women, they ask for weapon. For example, Maria Berlinska, veteran and advocate of women's rights in military, she visits US officials to ask for heavy weapon, and she's very active in social media. Actually, today is her birthday, so congratulations, Maria, with your birthday. And she explains very logically why Ukraine needs support and more weapons. Even human rights activists like Alexandra Matvichuk, she's famous human rights defender, and I was with her in one event about war, and I was actually impressed that she, being a human rights activist, and she coordinates Tribunal for Putin coalition, and she knows about all these war crimes. In her public speeches, she also asks for heavy weapon for support, and she explains the situation that it's very necessary for Ukraine to survive, and also for the realization and the documentation of all these terrible war crimes that Russia did to Ukraine. And what Ukrainian feminists think about this? For the last months, there were a number of feminist events where it became possible for Ukrainian feminists to discuss and to talk, to criticize anti-military position of some international feminists. And one of the very active public feminists, Tamara Zlobina, who is also editor of Gender in Details online resource, she joins this hashtag campaign Arm Ukraine Now. And actually, she her post and her explanation was, I would say, widely supported and shared among other Ukrainian activists and feminists. Moreover, Ukrainian also in March, I put screenshot from article where Ukrainians Daria Cymbaluk and Irina Zamuraeva, they write why we as a feminist must lobby for air defense for Ukraine. And it's actually their position is also quite clear that even despite the fact that we are critical of militarization, we do believe that pacifism actually doesn't work now, and it's very important. So heavy weapons support of West is very important for Ukraine in general and Ukrainian women particularly. also being agents, being those who, as I'm also actually a refugee scholar. I left Kyiv after 10 days, and now I'm, as a refugee scholar, live in Berlin. So I see how women organize and participate in different protests, and it's one of the very powerful protests in Berlin that was about embargo to Russian gas and oil, but it's also those people, especially women, they lie down on a ground to demonstrate the current situation and all this Bucha and the European massacres that happened in Ukraine. And from the other hand, women are victims and vulnerable groups in war. They are those that are forced to evacuate, those who also are responsible for children, elderly, disabled people. Women of different age groups, they suffer from this invasion. And as also Tomasz said, and probably you know now, there is also a lot of information about rapes and other, in general, sexual violence that happened in Ukraine during these 3 months of war. Women are in the risk group of sex trafficking, being in the vulnerable positions of those who evacuate. And at the same time, you could see that women are, there are now a number of projects and posters where, for example, mother from Kyiv protected her baby. She was heavily wounded, her daughter survived, and she became Ukrainian Madonna. Also, there are there is some mythology around women's involvement, and witchcraft is one of the myths and images that is used for Ukrainian women. Also, they are used by themselves, both military and non-military women. And in this situation where you can't expect that for example, Western countries will protect your sky. So you see this poster, girls, let's close the sky. And this images of witches, witchcraft is also demonstrates actually resistance and is used by some popular, for example, politicians, military people to demonstrate this metaphorical form of resistance. Women are those who organize, for example, evacuations, and those who help to rescue soldiers from captivity. One of the most famous, actually, public women is Irina Vereshchuk, Minister of Reintegration of Temporary Occupied Territories. And she published photo with Ukrainian soldiers liberated from Russian captivity, and among them are women. And you see this women are without head. And actually, the Ukrainian scholar Marta Gavryshko, who studies sexual violence, she writes about this, that it's a cruel attack on women's bodily integrity and intimacy because of cultural meaning of hair for women. Hair is a strong conjunction with femininity, women's self-perception and dignity. But you still see from this picture that these women, even despite the fact that they were in captivity, they were tortured and raped, they still demonstrate their dignity. And recent events, they show that Ukrainian society recognize women's role as also soldiers who fight and who defend their country, their home, and their children now. Probably you know that in the Eurovision Song Contest, Ukraine got first place, and Kalush Orchestra. After this, you may watch the video on this song Stefania, and in this video it contributes to the visibility of tens of thousands of Ukrainian female soldiers. And just to finalize, I would like to say that being a symbol of resistance and in a very terrible situation, Ukrainian women still like this woman who is who supports those captured in Azovstal. Her nickname is Song because she is singing and she is supporting herself and her fellow soldiers in this terrible situation, where among those who are died in Azovstal, probably if you follow the events, you know that now in Ukraine, our major hashtag is Save Azovstal. So among them are women who are died in these terrible circumstances. And on this slide, I will stop. And later I will be happy to answer your questions.
Thank you, Professor Tamara. It was a very informative, insightful, and moving presentation. On to Professor Vitaly Chernetsky, specialist in Slavic, in particular Ukrainian LGBTQ literature and film. Last but least, specialist in Jewish studies. He's director of the Center for Russian, East European, and Eurasian Studies, University of Kansas, formerly Columbia and Cornell. Professor Vitaly, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Tomasz. Thank you so much, Margareta from the Thanos Center. Can you hear me? Okay. So big thanks to everyone, and it is a great honor to be here and a challenge to follow dear friend and colleague Tamara Martsenyuk's powerful and moving presentation, because of course the topics that she raised and the images we just saw sear us all very powerfully. I would like to touch upon a couple of things here. One of them would be the very importance that we are having this panel here and having voices of Ukrainian scholars. And this is a big change and a big transformation that unfortunately took this terrible escalation of the war that started on February 24th, and of course the war that has been going since 2014. But it is important that these voices are being heard and that there is indeed agency and subjectivity given to Ukrainian speakers. I have been thinking a lot about the question of epistemic injustice and looking at this book and other books. Epistemic injustice is an important concept that was introduced by feminist philosopher Miranda Fricker in her influential book back in 2007, and very much is based on the traditions of feminist research and philosophy. And she addresses two particular kinds of issues there. That is the question of testimonial injustice and hermeneutic injustice. And both of those are very important in connection to how Ukrainian academics and Ukrainian studies and, generally Ukrainian community has been perceived within a worldwide sort of system of power in academia. Speaking as somebody who is Ukrainian myself, but based now for a long time in the West, specifically in the United States, I have had countless experiences of seeing Ukrainian topics marginalized, written out, and just approach through primarily a Russocentric lens. I've also seen many instances of enduring power of negative stereotypes, and colleagues who are otherwise quite sensitive and enlightened sometimes just you're Ukrainian, you're prejudiced, prove me that you are not a prejudiced person. So this, I was put in many times in a position of demanding to prove a negative, demanding to prove that I'm not an anti-Semite, demanding that I prove that I'm not racist, demanding that I prove that I'm not this or not that. And this is an experience that many Ukrainians have faced internationally. And this is, of course, a legacy of the discourse that was perpetrated in many ways with the help of the official Soviet position, where all positive Ukrainian contributions in the world eyes were silenced or erased or subsumed under Soviet or Russian imperial. And the only things that were allowed to be labeled Ukrainian were things that had some sort of negative associations. And this is an enduring problem in the reception of Ukraine in many Western societies. And there's been a lot of discourse on that in the context of many countries in Europe, including Germany, the esteemed host country of the current event. And it is, of course, this exists side by side with really wonderful and moving outpouring of help and support that we have been receiving in the last 80 plus days now that this war has been the new escalated stage of the war that has been going on. But it is this intellectual change, this paradigm shift in the making that I would like to really focus on and make sure that we understand this, and we cannot emphasize this strongly enough. One of the, of course, instances of where this has become starkly clear for the entire international community is with the situation for both gender equality and also of the condition of the LGBTQ plus community, because in this war, very much this is something that we can trace back to the Russian anti-democratic propaganda that the Russian government has been trying to spread in Ukraine since before the Revolution of Dignity. There were these fake sort of staged demonstrations that were happening in 2013 in anticipation of the then planned signed association agreement with the European Union, of people walking around in Kyiv with a sign saying Euro equals homo. So precisely the fear of Europe as a place of that a den of homosexual sin is something that was very actively used in the dirty political tricks by the Russian so-called political technologists in anticipation of those events. And this framing of the discourse has been directly impactful in how the conflict has proceeded in years that followed. And here we have, of course, for the queer community in Ukraine, a dilemma of visibility and advocating for its own rights versus the situation of the entire country being in danger because of the foreign aggression, but the foreign aggression that is specifically in particular also is using the scaremongering tactics that highlight the supposed queer threat. And so this challenge is something that has been addressed in many different ways. And we also see an important and profound evolution in how these things happened. Because if we look back to the situation of Euromaidan, of Revolution of Dignity of winter 13-14, that we have a lot of queer presence there, but queer presence that is not emphasized and announced. So you would not necessarily see rainbow flags, but there'll be folks who will be famous, like one of the prominent gay activists, Zorian Kis, with a famous poster sort of directly challenging Putin. So this is one of those things where we have, as often as happened in queer history, double coding. So some people, the people who knew that this is an important, gay rights activist, they saw that this is also a specifically sort of queer identified message, but for others it would not be. So this is basically going back to this sort of a pre-Stonewall idea of double coding. On the other hand, we see then with the war and also with the temporary turn to the right that we could see in the context of Ukrainian society reacting to the violence and to Russian invasion, that there was a stronger need shown to advocate the visibility of queer folks in all areas of life. So we've had in these past 8 years the story of the evolution of the having pride festivals in Ukraine, and how we went from the situations of danger and attacks by thugs to the much more visible and diverse participation, how it expanded to more cities, not just the capital city Kyiv, but also Odessa and Kharkiv and even Kryvyi Rih and many other cities like that, and dealing with simultaneously with many different challenges of anti-LGBTQ efforts, and some coming from the East in the Russian gays, some coming from the conservative Catholic side, so via Poland. So this has been indeed a significant challenge. But the push for visibility has really changed a lot because of these conservative right-wing discourses, and there was a very important movement started. It's called Військові ЛГБТІК+, та їхні союзники. So basically Ukrainian LGBTIQ in the military and their allies, and they have a Facebook page, a web page, and it's a registered NGO. And the history starts with a 2018 exhibition of photographs by the Ukrainian photographer based in the Netherlands, Anton Shebetko, called "Ми були тут," we were here. And most of the LGBTQ veterans at the time, or active duty military, did not feel comfortable to actually showing their faces. It was during that exhibition that one of them, Viktor Pilipenko, fully came out, and he became one of the leaders. And starting in 2018, indeed, there was a column of queer veterans and active duty military in pride marches. And so this is one of the changes that we've had. And here we see also one of the ways in which the situation in Ukraine, as in other East European countries, requires us to develop new optics towards what has been a very important discourse in Western queer studies, and that is the idea of homonationalism and pinkwashing in the context of the situations where queer societies are so much under attack. We have seen before the current war, in the couple of recent years, something that could be seen a little bit as pinkwashing attempts by Ukrainian government, where the visibility of prides was seen precisely as a message of see how progressive and European we are, where the day-to-day situation of the queer community remained very, very challenging. However, obviously nothing like in Russia. But it really has changed with the new escalation of the war, with the new transformation of the horizontal shaping of new Ukrainian civic nation as a progressive and diverse place, which is united by this new idea of belonging and inclusion that I think in the conditions of this terrible conflict really came to the prominence. And so this is something that you see very visibly. If you, for instance, go to the Instagram page of Kyiv Pride, you will see how many initiatives they have for helping those at the front. There have been a whole series of viral pictures of, for instance, gay entertainers, folks who, drag performers who now don uniforms and things of that nature. However, there are also very significant challenges that remain. And one of the big issues that, of course, requires attention is the situation of the transgender community, especially folks whose gender listed in the passport is not the one that they currently identify with. And this is the situation of the conscription law. So currently non-disabled males, or who the government views as males aged 18 to 60, are subject to conscription, and is especially for trans folks, this may create and has created instances of problems. However, these problems, while they're very important and we need to pay attention to them and address this very important, serious issue, is just one part of this very broad spectrum of society's mobilization and change. So with this, I probably should wrap up my initial remarks and give the floor to other participants. And again, thank you for having me here.
Thank you, Professor Vitaly Czerniecki, for your sophisticated and perspicacious presentation. And on to our next speaker, who is Dr. Natalia Czermałych, socio-legal anthropologist, postdoctoral fellow at the Universität de Genève, where she leads an interdisciplinary project, Can a Child Sue the State? Actually, I met Dr. Natalia as a curator of queer and gender art, and I think she will devote a lot of attention to art. Dr. Natalia, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Sabina, can you please put the PowerPoint? So hello, everyone, and greetings from Geneva. Thank you very much, Tomasz, and all the panelists, Samara, Vitaly, for your very beautiful and insightful comments. So, as Tomasz just mentioned, I'm a socio-legal anthropologist, so I work at the intersection of art and law right now. And today, I would like to come back a little bit to my initial identity as a scholar, the scholar of art. In 2015, I wrote a book that was called Shifting Landscapes, Ukrainian Artists Between Revolution and War. And this book spoke about events in Ukraine seen through the eyes of the Ukrainian artists, who generously shared with me not only their observations, feelings, and objects they make, but also their theoretical visions on personal and political events unfolding before their eyes. This method that in anthropology is called collaborative ethnography was at the center of my approach, and still is my way to produce analysis on Ukraine, even though, as Vitaly just said very justly, I had not so much opportunities to write about Ukraine because of, perhaps that I understand now, because of this epistemic injustices. After the 24th of February, I started a new project in which I speak to Ukrainian artists who created artistic objects in response to the war. And I'm trying to sort of weave together their experiences of displaced persons, creators, and also sensitive feminist thinkers. So today I would like to introduce one artist among them whose story, in my opinion, encapsulates quite beautifully and interestingly the transformations of what is the feminist identity and feminine identity in recent months in Ukraine. For myself, as a Ukrainian scholar, this plurivocal sort of ethnographic experiment and also feminist experiment was an attempt to reconcile facets of my professional identity that more often than not are in a sort of a profound disagreement. I'm a Western trained anthropologist working in the West, and I'm also a Ukrainian woman who has spent a large part of her life with artists. Both of them could not find, I would say, a just standpoint to write lately, buried in this feeling of constant grief and bitter feeling that Clifford Geertz, an American anthropologist, had beautifully termed the burden of authorship. So in the face of these sort of unspeakable and very difficult events that seemed and still seem scientifically undescribable, or at least often words fall. So for me, it was an opportunity to reflect on images, emotions, and the dynamic relationship between vulnerability and political agency. As Dr. had framed it recently, vulnerability that is understood not as precarity or weakness, but as relationally grounded possibility for political action that is also pushed forward and taken by artists and young female artists in particular. So my story will be about Maria Kulikovskaya, a performer and visual artist whose work tackles a wide range of feminist and politically relevant themes. Maria's story is one of artistic premonitions, something that Ruth Behar, another anthropologist, called, I quote her, the eerie power of fiction that foretells the future. Her deep and almost supernatural way of feeling and unraveling the catastrophic that is often buried under their impenetrable layers of political discourse. In 2014, after the annexation of Crimea, Maria laid down on the steps of the biggest museum in St. Petersburg, Hermitage, covered by Ukrainian flag. The war in eastern Ukraine was about to begin. In a 2016 performance, in a 2016 performance, she screamed naked or semi-naked on the sand of the yet peaceful beach in Mariupol in response to the sounds of the explosions in nearby cities. In 2019, 2 years before the Russian invasion, she created sculptural self-portraits, identical copies of her body made of soap, with holes of bullets around her head and heart. Sometimes I'm afraid of my own works, she told me once. They tend to come true. What I wanted to say that I first came to know Maria exactly with this performance when she laid in Russia in a huge Russian museum under this flag, but she was criticized and quite heavily by the artistic community because her gesture was considered nationalistic, or at least it was not okay at that moment to use this state-related symbolic. And I remember at that time taking her defense by writing that this symbol of a body laying under a flag is a sort of a cliche of war photography when a dead soldier lies under a flag. But in this particular case, she makes a sort of interesting feminist twist because it's a woman who lays under the flag, and she is alive. And I thought that it is interesting. Maybe this observation plays interestingly with what Tamara just said. And so today, when she saw, and I also saw these pictures on the pictures that Tamara was sharing, this unexpectedly, this performance that was considered an artistic performance and sort of a form of creativity was picked up and reproduced without knowing by this sort of emotional, I don't know, similarity by ordinary Ukrainian citizens and ordinary Ukrainian women. But first, when Kulikovskaya just started, she experienced as a 20-something-year-old art student in Kiev in 2010. She just reproduced her body in white plaster, as you can see here. During the following years, she used the same technique of molding, now fixing the contours of her gradually changing body in sculptures made of translucent soap. When exposed outside under the mercy of winds, rain, and snow, Maria's body, covered with white foam, slowly faded away, becoming thinner and thinner. These objects, shaped as a woman, a human being, signify the fragility of human life. After all, soap has a structure very similar to human flesh. It is a combination of water and fat, as Maria once told me in an interview. Even gun makers test their weapons on it. Some of Maria's bodies have had lives on their own. In 2012, a range of her body sculptures were exhibited in Izolatia, an independent art center located near the city of Donetsk in eastern Ukraine. After the end of the exhibition, the sculptures remained there. In summer 2014, several months after the annexation of Maria's native Crimea, the city of Donetsk was at the heart of the new war. The heavily armed paramilitary, Russian citizens who crossed the Ukrainian border, and local impoverished populations armed by Russia seized large eastern Ukrainian cities, proclaiming the independence of Donetsk and Luhansk popular republics. A long and exhausting war began. During the first months of occupation, the paramilitary turned Izolatia, the art place, into a prison and place of torture. 20 of Maria's sculptures, her fragile bodies, were used for target practice. All of them were heavily damaged. Someone sent the photographs the occupiers were taking and posting as jokes on social media. Several months later, at the opening of a group exhibition in London, Maria appeared naked, holding a hammer. She smashed one of her body sculptures, making explicit reference to the destruction of her art in Donbass. Maria called this performance Happy Birthday and dedicated it to her mother, whom she couldn't congratulate since her native Crimea was cut off from any communication channels after its annexation in March 2014. Since then, the body sculptures have seemed to acquire their own biographies, partially separated from the artist, biographies that she could later analyze almost as a distant observer and reintegrate to her emerging work. In 2019, Maria appeared in Forgotten, a feature film by Daria Onishenko, playing the role of a pro-Russian propagandist journalist. We saw her shoot her own soap sculptures, creating large bullets, holes in the heart and around the heart, and the head and around the heart. Reflecting on the film, Maria said, "I tried to reconstruct these moments to find an answer. Why did they shoot them? But I still don't have any, only the sculptures with holes inside." When I interviewed Maria in March 2022, she had already become a war refugee, temporarily living in Austria. On the record of our conversation, I hear not only her voice, but also her daughter crying and her mom singing to calm her down. It was also a moment for me when my family came to join me in Geneva. So it was an interesting sort of new way of interviewing artists. And I would like to give her voice through my own, but what she says can be a little bit triggering for some people in the audience, so just I want to avoid. I didn't sleep the night before the war began. I heard the first explosions in real time. I didn't have any illusions about it. I knew the war would come. My bag with some money, documents, and diapers was ready. After the first explosions, we ran to the metro to hide, but there were too many people there. The station was crowded, and we went back home. We were hiding in the parking lot. The explosion restarted. They were louder and louder. It was like a horror movie. Dark clouds, thick fog. It was dark. I was paralyzed with fear, but wanted to save Eva. She is only 5 months old. In Kyiv, we live on the 21st floor, just in front of the TV tower that was destroyed several days later. In Eva's room, we arranged large new windows so she could see the TV tower and its lights. When the war started, I covered these new beautiful windows with tape. Now I was afraid of the fragility of their glass. We slept on the cardboard under several blankets, as far from windows as we could. During the night, we heard shelling and Kalashnikovs. It was total chaos. We were spending days and nights in the parking lot on cardboard. The smell of gasoline was unbearable. After a missile fell on my friend's house, I had a breakdown. I yelled and cried and yelled again. It was too much. We had to go now, I knew it. But my husband had just sold our car. I was reaching out to taxis, to people with cars. Please take us. I will pay you as much as you want. Just take us out of here. But no one could. We were 5 people, including a baby, and there was not enough space. Maria recounts what she calls her skitania, their wanderings, that lasted almost 3 weeks. By a miracle, they were driven out of Kyiv by a woman from the same building, whom they met accidentally in the basement during an air raid. She had a car, but was afraid of driving alone with her son and their 3 cats. Together they drove east, from curfew to curfew, first to Khmelnytsky, then to Mukachevo, and finally to Uzhhorod, a small town at the border with Hungary. Once there, Eva fell ill. She had diarrhea. She did not take a bath or sleep in a bed for weeks. My parents too were losing hope and thought about going back to Kyiv. We knew no one in Western Ukraine. But then a miracle happened. A museum in Austria offered Maria, with her daughter and parents, a short-term residency. The director of the museum even came to Uzhhorod to pick them up by car, driving 1,000 kilometers back and forth. Maria's husband went back to Kyiv, as men are not allowed to cross the border. At the very moment when we crossed the border, Maria recalls, we received an unexpected gift, sunflower seeds made of porcelain, by Ai Weiwei. Ai Weiwei and our host had had dinner just before he came to Ukraine, and the artist regretted not having a gift for us. He looked in his pockets and found 4 seeds, 1 per member of my family. For us, this was a gift of a future life and peace. We wrapped them in a piece of cloth and stored them with our documents in a safe bag where we keep important objects. One of the objects that Maria regrets having left behind is her latest self-portrait, made of translucent soap with visible bullets inside. Oh, these are not bullets, sorry, like this, but with bullets, which she uncovered for the first time the day before the war. Creating a soap sculpture takes time. Similarly to a butterfly in a cocoon, a soap sculpture has to rest for a long time in a silicone mold. The first days of war, in the basement, she was there with us. But then we left her behind in a besieged city. The sculptures that were originally meant to represent Maria's exploration of the boundaries of her individual body came to signify the transformation of territorial borders under the influence of international politics, war, and invasion, and their impact on human bodies and of Ukrainian women as a collectivity. After February 24, Ukrainian women were the first to experience a new form of agentive mobility. They have become the initiators of displacement, leading their extended families out of Ukraine towards relative safety and an uncertain future. Jak ty? How have you been? Is the most common question that Ukrainian women, including myself, exchanged relentlessly during the months of February and March 2022. One of the responses of my interviewees struck me by its accuracy, and I quote my interviewee. I'm so tired. I have a feeling of living multiple lives. My previous life, my refugee life, my family life, my life with the news, and more and more. This phrase reminded me of Maria's sculptures. Long before the war, she seemed to have predicted this now commonly shared experience through her multiple sculptural bodies strewn across cities of Ukraine as marks of the expanding invasion and as this sort of empty shells of her previous selves. And I think that this image is a beautiful symbol for what Ukrainian women and people who identify as women face right now. This sort of collage of previous selves that are layered inside one's body. And I would like to stop here.
Thank you, Dr. Natalia, for your beautiful and touching presentation. we move on to habilitated Dr. or Professor Ewa Majewska, who is a feminist philosopher and activist living in Warsaw. She taught at the University of Warsaw and the Jagiellonian University in Krakow, but she was also a visiting scholar at the University of California, Berkeley, ICI Berlin, and IWM Vienna. She has published 4 books in Polish and 1 book in English, which is brand new from Warsaw. Professor Ewa Majewska, the floor is yours.
Thank you so very much for the invitation to participate in this, for me, quite amazing gathering and discussion. Thank you for having beautiful words to actually invite all of us to think about the war, to think about patriarchy and patriarchal legacy, to think about Putin and the war in Ukraine, and to think about the feminist and queer perspectives. This is an eloquent invitation in a time when many of us, I think, felt very mutated by the aggression of all tools of war. So therefore, I'm very happy to be here, and thank you for having the words that for me were very difficult to find. Also because living in Poland, in Warsaw, of course, I was somehow enmeshed in all kinds of networks of solidarity, of affective exchanges, etc., which makes it obviously slightly more difficult to have this reflexive distance. So here in Berlin, where I find myself physically right now, I actually feel slightly more readiness to address the topics as you suggested and to join you in the discussion. I had this fortune and misfortune in the same time of following a seminar during another war, also an imperial war, namely the one that the United States of America launched against Iraq in 2003. The seminar that I was going to was led by Professor Ellen Sixu, also a very important inspiration for Tomasz and for many of us, I believe. And her seminar was entitled Writing with the Hand Torn Away from a Child in the Time of War. So basically, this was her formula of trying to, verbally address the situation of war, which was obviously very violent in some sort of way, but also very surrealist, very metaphoric, I would say. And what we were doing in that seminar was basically reading Marcel Proust, À la recherche du temps perdu. And I don't know if you remember, but in the last volume of this book, there is this quite amazing, I would say 100, 150 pages, I don't remember exactly, of various discourses, of various narratives, how people talk about the war. So you have salespersons talking about the war, aristocrats, aristocratic women, princesses, their servants, lovers, prostitutes, sex workers, but prostitutes as they were described in the early 20th century narrative. All layers of society, they compose this kind of beehive of exchanges about the war. And after reading all those pages, we know one thing. We can be certain of one thing, that there is nothing that we can be certain of, that the war is coming and nobody knows. Even the generals, military professionals, they have no idea, basically. So this is this kind of uncertainty that also makes it much more complex, I think, and much more complicated to address the current moment in time. But I wanted to start it from something else. I had even a title for my presentation, which was basically Somebody's Gonna Have to Answer, a feminist critique of patriarchal politics. And Somebody's Gonna Have to Answer is basically a fragment of lyrics of a very famous song one day by Tracy Chapman. The title is Why. And in the song, she sings, "Love is hate, war is peace. No is yes, and we're all free." And then a little bit later, but somebody's going to have to answer. The time is coming soon when the blind remove their blinders and the speechless speak the truth. So basically, I think for many of us who grew up in what was called the Eastern Bloc, what's now more generously called Central and Eastern Europe, love is hate, war is peace are words almost borrowed, I think, from Orwell's novel. 1984, right? And they remind very much. They remind very much the works of propaganda of the communist time that have been, I think, quite meticulously repeated in the moment of the launching of the war on the 24th of February this year, and obviously before. So Putin's narrative concerning the war has been not only a machist one that has the brutality of an effort to actually eradicate an entire population, because this is what he's been talking about, this is what he had been writing about. So it has the cruelty and the violence somehow logically necessary to perpetuate genocide and war crimes, but it also has this other side, which is a little bit more forgotten in our Foucauldian feminist, critical circles, which is basically this peculiar relation with the truth, which is basically, it's not that he says lies. He speaks a language, Putin speaks a language that not only makes sense, but that decomposes the sense-making ability of our brains, basically. So it's a very popular, specialists of terrorism, of propaganda would give you a much better and more apt description of Putin's agency than I can do, not being a professional of political discourse. But still, my effort is to say that this kind of narrative is somehow eroding all sense, not only in order to make the global population who is listening to Putin's speech more vulnerable to any kind of lie that he can invent next. Perhaps, next month we're going to hear that, I don't know, Ukrainians have 3 years or something, and it could also pass if nobody tries to challenge Putin's narrative. So the propaganda work that Putin is using, on one hand, is making not much sense and spreading lies. On the other hand, it is eradicating our ability to critically address to his discourse and more generally to the news discourse. And yet, on another hand, he sort of shows us the direction to disappointment. We are supposed to be so fed up with this lack of certainty and lack of truth that we, I think, are intended to not question whatever we are hearing and kind of find ourselves in a situation of despair. So speaking from Berlin, I remember one very famous Polish Jewish woman who used to live here and who spoke about despair in a very interesting way, namely Rosa Luxemburg. I believe her legacy is very important to bring back in the time of Russia's imperialist war. Why? Rosa Luxemburg was one of the first people to criticize the authoritarianism of Soviet Russia. So not only of the Tsarist Russia, this she did very eloquently, but Rosa Luxemburg was also one of those people to torpedo the newborn Soviet Union. So she would be the first to criticize the censorship, the abuses, the power abuses, the lack of democracy in that country, right? So when we are reminded by our colleagues, different feminists of the left, especially in the United States, that Rosa Luxemburg should be recalled, yes, she should, with the criticism of propaganda, of censorship, of abuse, of authoritarianism. This is the part of the legacy of Rosa Luxemburg that we desperately need. We also need the courage and audacity, I think, the courage and audacity to speak up to the machine of lies. One of our colleagues who already spoke mentioned that it's a whole complex of propaganda. It's not one person, it's not Putin inventing his propaganda. It's basically extremely well-trained branches of people, entire institutions working on how to reconstruct and deconstruct our intellectual capacity globally in order to accept whatever Russia is proposing. So on the one hand, we have as our previous speakers told us, we have the army in which women, for instance, and queer persons as well, even anarchists are fighting. And this is a very interesting shift of the feminist queer positions that I agree should be noted. But then on the other hand, we have also the kind of dialectics between not only violence and peace, but also between abuses of power and being abused, surviving abuse, and going further. So many people compared the situation of today's Ukraine with the situation of somebody who experiences rape and gender-based violence, and Putin's position with the position of the perpetrator. And I believe this is a very legitimate, unfortunately and sadly, a very legitimate comparison. But in this comparison, what is important is not whether the survivor of sexual assault, whether she's violent or not, whether she's a pacifist or not. This is the last in a row. The most important is, however, that in order to survive such violence, we need to stay in solidarity and we need to practice a togetherness which excludes exceptionality. We cannot hold on to the idea that I'm going to be, the absolutely uncomparable, exceptional person. This is not the harsh individualism is not our practice. We should be a little bit more common, also in a sense of like ordinary, unheroic, and like this we can hold hands and do things together. And I believe that this is the most top secret anti-fascist weapon and feminist and queer weapon that we have. So I'm revealing a secret now, but perhaps it's worth to speak about it. But the solidarity between, let's say, also Polish population, Ukrainian population, all kinds of people globally engaging in a situation, in the situation of war, this is a common effort of variously enmeshed individuals who resign of their individuality in order to share apartments, to share resources, to share academic positions, to share anything that we can share. And like this, we never walk alone. And Putin does. Because his ambition is to become this imperial leader, this sovereign, this absolute sovereign, like in Carl Schmitt theory of exception, right? He wants to be the absolute sovereign who creates law, but who is beyond the power of law and the rule of law, etc., etc. So he can continue. And this is, I think, a very patriarchal subjectivity that Putin is performing, or this exceptionality. Whether we hold a gun or not, whether we are in the army or we are pacifists, whether we are doing solidarity, in which form, whatever we like, I think our resignation from this exceptionality, from this exemption of law, of the rules, etc., in our commonality, we are much stronger, I believe. We are much more interesting. We are much more queer in a sense also of being very different and very heterogeneous. And that could be a way to be saved. So thank you so much for your attention. I hope that I added some new elements to the constellation of associations that we've had until now. And I pass the voice to further speakers. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor Ewa Majewska, for your innovative and anti-fascist presentation. On to our next speaker, who is Professor Paweł Leszkowicz, interested in Ukrainian queer art as activism, curator of an international, including Ukrainian exhibition Ars Homo Erotica at Warsaw's National Museum, professor and head of modern and contemporary art, Poznań University, affiliate of Humboldt Universität. Professor Paweł Leszkowicz, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me, please?
Yes, yes.
Yes, I will try to show my PowerPoint presentation. I don't know if I'm going to be successful with it, to be honest. If not, I will just go without this PowerPoint presentation. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yes, apologies. I am struggling with my PowerPoint presentation, so maybe Sabine can help me with this, because I've sent Sabine my PowerPoint presentation.
But you just show it to us.
But this was not the right one. I am very not familiar with Webex, hence my problems.
Okay, let me see.
So I will start my presentation. I am going to talk about one series of artwork. So I think that it would be okay. So you can see it. I intend to point out the recent developments in LGBTQ art and activism in Ukraine, especially at the time of war, on the basis of a contextual analysis of artwork by Ukrainian artist Anton Shebetko. I will present a minoritarian queer perspective on the invasion, with some historical perspective on queer history art of Ukraine in the 21st century. We Were Here by Anton Shebetko is a series of photographic portraits highlighting the role played in the war against the Russians by queer soldiers in the Ukrainian army since 2014. The series consists of photo, prints on textile, videos, and audio interviews. It was created within the Art Residency project Coming Out of Isolation Through Art to Visibility, organized by the Izolacja Cultural Center and the Kiev Pride NGO with the support of the German EVZ Foundation. The purpose of the project Coming Out of Isolation was to raise, next slides, was to raise and counter an issue of discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity in Ukraine through the means of art. We Were Here is a series of photographs of mostly masked, camouflage Ukrainian queer soldiers and volunteer fighters, both men and women. You can show the images, Sabina, please. They were engaged in the anti-terrorist operation in the east of Ukraine, and when the portraits were taken in 2018, the soldiers were in joint forces operation. The portraits are intended to show the conflict and reconciliation between their identities, as on the one hand, Ukrainian soldiers who are fighting in the war with the Russians, and on the other hand, queer individuals who are heroes, but at the same time forced to hide their identity because of the danger of homophobic reactions and trouble in the army with its rigidly masculine structure. Many of the soldiers have to stay in the closet not only during the service, but also in civilian life. You can show, please, the next 5 images slowly. They are out in the project about visibility, but as playfully, sometimes grotesquely masked people. The portraits conceal their identities through military uniforms, composition, poses, a variety of face covers, sometimes concealed with impastos of rainbow paint and colors. Some of the portraits are stern, others joyful. The visual strategy of concealment, partially hiding the soldier's identity, is not unique to Ukraine. Indeed, similar influential photographic projects have been organized in the West in the last 20 years, particularly in the US around the political discussions around Don't Ask, Don't Tell, on accepting openly queer soldiers in the American army. Next photograph, please. When the far right opposed the queer movements in Ukraine, especially the marches of equality in Kiev between 2013 and 2019, they used the argument that the country is at war in the East, and events like this are neither appropriate nor patriotic, that homosexuality is a threat to national security. Thus, the artist intended to show the queer fighters in the war, those who were there, who contributed to combat, but have been forced into invisibility and hence not acknowledged. Shebetko's intention was to counter the nationalistic far-right gender ideology that queer people, especially gay men, are not defending their country. Next photograph, please. In 2018, the exhibition was a starting point for the self-organization of queer soldiers and veterans into a supportive network. There was even an idea to organize a gay unit in the army, and an NGO promoting equal rights for LGBT people in the army was established. The face of the movement, next photograph please, is and next one, and next one, and next one. The face of my movement is Viktor Pilipenko. This is the only soldier whose face is not covered by the paint. There is also a video interview with him. As a soldier, Pilipenko visited the US and was inspired by queer activism in the American army. Let us consider the broader context. Since Euromaidan in 2013-14, the revolution of dignity opened the possibility of dignity for queer people. A procession organized by gay rights activists took place even amidst the successful Euromaidan protest. Some queer activists who had the experience of participating in the Euromaidan fights are now joining the territorial defense forces or getting training in paramedical help. Ukraine's desire to join the EU has strongly impacted its opening up to LGBTQ rights, and this in turn has fueled gay citizens' desire to defend the democratizing country, to fight for freedom against the homophobic Putin's Russia. Next image, please. The support, and next one, and next one, and next one. This is the openly out soldiers Viktor Pilipenko. The support for Ukrainian sovereignty is also support for LGBT rights and all human rights. In 2015, discrimination based on sexual orientation was banned in the workplace in Ukraine. Volodymyr Zelensky, elected in 2019, became the first president to acknowledge LGBT citizens and publicly state his willingness to do more about equality. In 2020, his government proposed hate crime legislation that included equality and included protection for queer people despite strong against hate crime, despite strong opposition from religious groups. Before the current war, many queer people from Russia, Belarus, Kazakhstan, and even some African countries migrated to Ukraine to escape discrimination in their countries. There are no repressive laws, like in Russia, where the 2013 law against so-called gay propaganda prohibits pride parades and makes it difficult to publicly show or address queerness in culture and public life. Thus, there is a strong fear that if Russia wins, queer people in Ukraine would lose everything that they have gained with great difficulty in recent years. In interviews, many involved in activism who decided to join the combat as soldiers, medical and food aid emphasized that they are fighting not only for the freedom of their country, but for the free world, for liberal democracy, for human rights and queer rights. Viktor Pilipenko, the out soldiers, says, "We are confronting a tyrannical, homophobic enemy. Yet the story is more dramatic, ambivalent, difficult. Homophobia also exists inside Ukraine. It is not only Russia. Ukraine legalized gay sex in 1991, but conservative activists and politicians regularly target the rights and livelihood of queer people. The queer battle of ideologies and images has been raging in Ukraine for years, backed by the Eastern Orthodox Church and the Russian-funded extremist groups, politicians and oligarchs. There is a strong internal political and religious opposition against the advancement of queer rights and culture. Increased queer visibility has created a conservative backlash. The artists and activists behind the Pride Festival have been soldiers or on the barricades of this internal anti-queer war for a long time. Homophobic images play a significant role here, especially in the opposition movement against Pride. There were billboards with slogans, association with the EU means same-sex marriage, Protesters against closer links with the EU carried signs showing stick figures engaged in anal sex and chanted slogans, "Go to Europe through the ass." Next image, please. Next image. Yes. And next image. Yes, this is the homophobic opposition. There have been a lot of homophobic violence and hate crimes in recent years. Queer events and community centers have frequently been attacked by far-right groups and require a heavy police protection. There have been a number of attacks against exhibitions and film screenings, in which artworks were destroyed. Cultural events that are advertised as queer have to be planned well in advance with rigorous security measures. They caused riots in Kiev, Odessa, and Kharkiv. Yet the queer scene has been growing despite and against these attacks. The Kiev Pride inspired anarcho-feminist marches and movement. In addition to the Pride, there is the Women's March, and the feminist campaigns are very visible. Hence, the progressive, pro-European movement is queer feminist, and contemporary art plays an important role in it. Why? Because artists are the main force that has been creating powerful images to counter the far-right campaigns of hatred and denigration. In Eastern Europe, sexual politics plays a significant role in the new divide between East and West, free and authoritarian societies. The Russian Orthodox Church supports Putin war. The head of the church, Patriarch Kirill, stated in a sermon that Russia's invasion of Ukraine is because of Western non-traditional values. The war is about which side of God's humanity will be on. That on the Western government that supports the Pride marches or their opponents. He argued that the Pride parades were a loyalty test to the West. Hence, according to him, the war against Ukraine is more important than politics. It is a war against the scene. It is a spiritual combat. For years, Russia has been supporting anti-gay sentiments in Ukraine in an effort to push back the EU Eastern expansion. Using stern opposition against queer rights, Putin presents his Russia as the champion of traditional value and religion in the global war against the West. Ukraine and its queer community are the battlefields of this conflict. Many queer Ukrainians have been serving in the army. Military service for men is compulsory. Homosexuality is not a reason for exemption. Such times of crisis like that of war shows how much gender matters in a society. War amplifies gender divisions, inequalities, and violence, including sexual violence. All men aged 18-60 are ordered to remain in the country and must register and be ready to fight. They have no choice. This strictly enforced rules has left many trans women and non-binary people stranded, with queer organizations in neighboring countries, Hungary and Poland, trying to get them out. The call to fight and its patriotic sentiments are not the only side of the queer community in Ukraine. Many gay men try to avoid the service. Many young queer people prefer to flee and escape the nightmare of war or Russian occupation. The pressure of patriotism is incredibly strong, but there are dissenting voices and positions. The queer movement in Ukraine is currently one of the most developed activist movements in the civil society there. According to Kiev Pride organizers Anna Sharyhina, in its diversity, it has both right and left wing, spread from patriotic homonationalism to cosmopolitan queer anarchism. Both, but Shebetko's patriotic project grapples with homonationalism. The photo series, We Were Here, and the patriotic participation of queer Ukrainians in the fight inspires a rethinking of the topical Western concept of homonationalism used by the critical queer theory. I am finishing soon. Next slide, please. Next slide. Let's stay with this one. Homonationalism is the alliance between a nationalist ideology and queer people all their rights. The term was introduced by Jasbir Puar to refer to the strategies by which some political fractions in the US support the queer community in order to justify racist, xenophobic politics, especially against Muslims. These fractions appeal to the prejudices that migrant people are homophobic and that Western society is egalitarian. Therefore, sexual diversity and queer rights are used to sustain political repression against immigration in the United States and in Western Europe. But tellingly, the American theory of homonationalism, very trendy, very fashionable, is absolutely inapplicable to the majority of Eastern Europe, where a strict heteronationalism rules and terrorizes queer community. The queer...
Otherwise, sorry, could you draw the conclusion?
Yes.
We are running out of time, please.
So the queer patriotic position in the Ukrainian war additionally problematizes homonationalism. And this image, another image by Anton Shebetko, perfectly gets to the core of the problem. It shows the artist supporting with his body a flag which is sewn from the rainbow flag, where the longest parts are yellow and blue, which means the Ukrainian flag. So he's burdened by double identity. This is the identity of a Ukrainian, but also an identity of a gay man. Shebetko performance shows how the intersectionality of national and sexual identities can be an oppressive condition in this dramatic context. The self-portrait is also a powerful work about homonationalism in Eastern Europe, but also about queer masculinity, and prophetically presents how the gay men right now have no choice but to embrace or surrender to both flags and both identities. It is chosen to enforce homonationalism.
Thank you, Professor Paweł Leszkowicz, for your intriguing and inspiring presentation. And let's give the floor to the audience, which is very diverse. We have people from all over the world, from Bangladesh, Mexico, the US, and of course, Europe. Thank you.
Thank you.
Tomasz, I see that there are some questions in the chat. Maybe we can start with that questions, and so give a little bit of time to the rest of the audience if they also want to share questions or comments in the chat. I don't know if you can see the questions. There was one that was sent to me as host privately, but I can share it with everyone. It's a question from Steph of den Berge. And the question is, how is this situation for women of color or with refugee background to take part and to be seen? The question was made during the presentation from Tamara, but maybe I don't know if the other guests also want to say something regarding this.
Dear speakers, please join us.
Yeah, thanks a lot for your questions. In my presentation, I concentrate mainly on women of different age. At the same time, as for a diversity of women of color or like different ethnic groups in Ukraine, I would say the very visible so-called minority group Roma women, and also Crimea Tatar women. And Crimea Tatar as a group, after annexation of Crimea, they again faced the need to evacuate and to become refugees in other territories of Ukraine. And actually, yesterday it was the International Day of Commemoration of forced deportation of Crimean Tatars from Crimea. And maybe you know the singer Jamala. She also, as far as today I refer on Eurovision Song Contest, she actually won also Eurovision with song on the destiny of Crimea Tatars. That was, I would say, very unexpectedly. So these women are they also participate actively, and some are some, of course, are refugees. Some are killed in war, and we have a couple of examples of Crimea Tatar women. As for Roma women in Ukraine, for last years, we have, of course, when we measure a social distance to different groups, so to Roma people, the largest, I would say, social distance, and there is problem with homophobia in Ukrainian society. At the same time, Roma people, men, they are in armed forces, so women actively participate in lobbying Roma rights and Roma visibility. For example, activist Zola Kondor, as far as I follow her, she's in Strasbourg now trying to talk about this, also the situation with war and problems that women as refugees they face in Ukraine. So probably I will stop here with my answer.
Thank you, Professor Tamara Marceniuk. Would other speakers have a comment? Have a comment, please?
I have a comment and question for Eva Majewska. Is this the right time, or can we have this conversation right now? I would like to salute to Eva Majewska and her excellent ideas, very well presented. I am especially taken by the idea of equality, solidarity, normality, as you use this term, but also anti-egocentrism, anti-narcissistic egocentrism, which is very important psychologically and politically at the time. But on the other hand, you mentioned that Putin is alone. Well, that's true to some extent. But when we talk about the images of war and how they are presented on our screens and through the screens to some extent in our unconscious, we have the powerful image of Putin. And on the other hand, we have very powerful image of another man. This is the image of Volodymyr Zelensky. And this is how the war is presented on the screens of the global media. We have the images of destroyed cities. But we don't see really the gendered victim of the war. When it comes to sexual violence, women or men who experience sexual violence, mostly women, they don't show their faces. And probably they will never show their faces. Even if we have the coverage about sexual violence in the media, they are anonymous usually. So in fact, we have the image of soldiers, we have the images of destruction, we have the image of sometimes escaping civilians, but the dominant images are still patriarchal. This is Putin, the evil, versus Zelensky, the good side. So so the representation sustains.
Yes, let Eva comment.
Hello. I absolutely salute you for saluting me, and we can be very I mean, it's so seldom that, you know, that queer people and feminists and women do this salutary remarks that I'm jumping into it. But basically, I would be modest if it was in a different context. But here I'm kind of like, yes, absolutely. So I would like to mention Heather Love, who is a fantastic queer studies scholar from the University of Pennsylvania, and who worked in her articles and I believe also book publications on the issue of normalcy and normativity versus, in the context of queer theory and queer lives, queer social and cultural representations and functioning. So this issue of normalcy is a large one, and ordinarity and all this. But as you know, my thinking about weak resistance for many years now has been focusing also on how certain forms of life, of social and cultural life, that we might perceive as weak because they are so ordinary, because they are so exceptional, etc., how they can become politically interesting, and how they can become an alternative to the narcissistic macho power struggles. And I jumped in the conversation in the moment when you were talking about Volodymyr Zelensky, because he has a queer past in at least his media kind of functioning and presentation. So he has this fantastic clip where he and three other members of his band dance this kind of Vogue style queer dance, I would call it. So this is a masculinity which is obviously also strong, powerful, very persistent, I would say, and also playing the best of his roles ever. I believe that he is going to be counted among one of the best politicians of the 21st century, if not the best one. We will see what's going to happen. And the version of masculinity that he's performing is a different one. It's not this machist one, it's a caring one, for instance. So I would suggest we need a dialectics, and we need a dialectics, not a hegemonic dialectics, you know, of Stalin's kind of making, of Stalin's historical and political performance, but a dialectics that is actually embedded in Hegel, and that continues on with Rosa Luxemburg, with other, you know, anti-authoritarian communists, let's put it this way, and anarchists and other people. So basically, we need a dialectics that is capable to render the contradictions and the perplexities without erasing them. And I believe Zelensky is a very interesting version of masculinity. Just to, you know, give a hint and leave the floor to others. Thank you for the question.
Thank you. And we have a question and comment from Anna K. Thank you so much for these insights, Vitaly. We encountered issues with international groups not co-signing advocacy documents asking for support for trans individuals, not to create an image of LGBT Ukrainians fleeing the country. I appreciated you looking into pinkwashing and the need for visibility. I wonder if the presenters have also views about masculinities and conflict in Ukraine. Vitaly, Professor Vitaly, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Tomasz. I first of all would like to follow up on the remarks most recently by Pavel and Eva, in that indeed we have new images of masculinity. And if we look at the transformation of President Zelensky, of course, for many Ukrainians, especially Ukrainians on the politically liberal and left segments of society, his election was greeted back in 2019 with a lot of skepticism and concern that there was a generational change, but in terms of the kind of public representation that the comedy show of which he was a part of and things of that kind, they were seen as quite problematic and made a lot of people uncomfortable, including in the queer community, including among feminist activists. So the remarkable thing is to see, in fact, the growing up and the transformation that a leader that a very significant portion of Ukrainian civil society treated with considerable skepticism actually found ways to transform himself. So we do see in this case a transformation, including a transformation into a different kind of masculinity. So the masculinity, the kind of a construction of masculinity of Zelensky that we see pre-February 24 and afterwards is quite different. And it's not the macho, stereotypical sort of militant, heteronormative masculinity necessarily, even though there are elements of that, but it is a masculinity of some sort of authenticity under pressure and rising to the challenge of stress, and also being able to mobilize different alternative resources. I mean, there was, in fact, if we look at, since Pavel mentioned something that I'm sorry that we had this temporal lag, with both Viktor Polapenko and Anton Shebetko's earlier project. Zelensky actually tweeted a picture of Viktor Polapenko against a rainbow background in a military uniform with the hashtag Arm Ukraine Now. So in the similar series that Tamara Marcinyuk mentioned earlier with Tamara Zlobina's portrait, the feminist scholar, also with the same hashtag. So we see in this sense the change and transformation of the inclusivity of the kind of masculinity is accepted. So this is what I was hinting at, however cursorily in my remarks, is that we have a new kind of a horizontally integrated civil society that began developing at a very rapid pace after the Revolution of Dignity, and in the context of the new escalation of the war after February 24th, it has sort of got turbocharged. So the processes have accelerated, and a lot of folks who, in all tragic situations, there are folks who are still trying to sort of take advantage of it unfairly, but those kind of problematic discourses and folks engage in those kind of problematic politics, they end up being not able to hold center stage. So I think the tendency, the transformation that we see in the context of Ukrainian society in this time of great suffering and great trauma, the resilience of the society, that ability to mobilize and evolve actually has been really moving and really inspiring. And so this is where I see the great hope. Mm-hmm.
If I may just interject one sentence, I was thinking when you were talking about, when you were explaining the recent transitions within the Ukrainian society, I was thinking of the notion of transversality from Felix Guattari. Somehow, the ability to produce and maintain change and resistance via all means that are given. Mm-hmm. Kinds of allies. It reminds me also of Lech Wałęsa, being beautifully supported by Elton John, mm-hmm. and having whether to greet Elton John in 2005 after Elton John got married, mm-hmm. came with his husband to Sopot, mm-hmm. and Wałęsa had doubts whether he should officially welcome Elton John and his husband, or maybe somehow, pretend that he's ill or whatever. Eventually, in the end, he decided to actually greet Elton John. But, that's the kind of, but solidarity in the 80s, the movement of solidarity did not have this kind of doubts, because it mm-hmm. was, the question was to survive under the conditions of the state of war and then quite oppressive end of the state communism. So therefore, this kind of controversies, whether we are more siding with liberals or socialists. Labor movement from France was a big supporter of solidarity, just as well as Republican senators in the United States. And these are groups no common grounds whatsoever. And then suddenly, in the moment of solidarity, they became allies, strategic allies. I think this notion of strategic alliance also very I think it also helps here.
Thank
Absolutely.
you. We have a comment from Professor Tamara Marceniuk. I agree that Zelensky's masculinity is not a hegemonic one. We have 2 minutes, I think. Who would like to take the floor, please?
If we have silence, what I would like to propose as closing things is just to see where we go from here, because I think that the gathering that we had, the exchange of ideas, has been hugely important, and we brought in both data from the field and observations and close readings of individual projects, as in Natalia Chernovik's analysis of what Maria Kulikovskaya is doing, and a broader, bigger interpretive framework. So I think what is really exciting about what we have begun here, and I hope that it is to be continued, is indeed developing building up on the conceptual tools that we have, and also in the conceptual tools that we're in the process of discovering, given this amazing transformation that in this very traumatic circumstances we see happening in Ukraine, that it becomes something that can, in fact, inspire and inform different visions of inclusion and belonging and identification that go beyond just short-term strategic solidarity of the incompatible groups, which is, of course, happening. And I here absolutely agree with Eva Majewska about this. But to see what kind of lasting change it is creating, not only in Ukraine, but hopefully inspired by Ukraine in other places, especially given how much the idea of Europe, the utopian idea of Europe, was important for Ukraine, both in Euromaidan, Revolution of Dignity, hence the Euro in the Maidan, and in the current situation of the war, that it is giving Europe, the European Union, that was having its malaise and doubts, a new reason to try to actually look for its original utopian promise and try to live to that promise and make itself relevant going forward. So such utopian hopes, I mean, utopians, of course, are always dreamers, but I hope at least some of those dreams will have practical relevance and applicability for us going forward.
Thank you, Professor Vitaly Czernetsky. I also dream of a continuation of our research together, and if the Margherita von Brentano Center would graciously host us in the foreseeable future, I would be most obliged. I would like to give the floor to Sabina Garcia-Pater.
Thank you, Tomasz, and thank you to everyone for being here today. I really think we had a great conversation, a great dialogue, and of course the doors are open, and I'm pretty sure that we will discuss further with Tomasz about possibilities to continue this dialogue. So yeah, I also thank you to all the attendees for being here, and just to finish today's session, I want to tell you that we will meet again on July 7 to continue discussing about gender conflicts and social justice. And this time under the topic researching war and its aftermath through a feminist lens. So everyone is welcome to join and continue the discussion. The session is convened by the Center for Interdisciplinary Peace and Conflict Research, Interact, at Freie Universität Berlin. So you can find all the information and registration link and everything on the website of the Margherita von Brentano Center. And that's from my side. So thanks again to everyone, and a good day and a good afternoon wherever you are. Thank you.
If I may take the opportunity, how can I ever thank enough Sabina, Heike, and all these distinguished speakers? Thank you, our audience, whom I would like to greet with our solidarity and hospitality. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you very much. Also, it was a pleasure. I would love to continue discussing, but also maybe writing. So perhaps we could think also of collecting our ideas in a written form. That I think could be quite interesting as well. Thank you so very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye. Thank you so much.